Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Emma Gillespie.
I'm Billi FitzSimons.
A moment of silence on a Gold Coast football pitch last week set off a chain of events involving the Australian Federal Police, a middle-of-the-night phone call between two world leaders, and an extraordinary visa decision against the backdrop of an active war. In today's deep dive, we are going to explain everything you need to know about the Iranian women's football team and the federal government's decision to grant players asylum.
Emma, I would say that this is probably the biggest story in Australia this week. And just to set the scene, I want to explain why the Iranian women's football team was in Australia in the first place.
Yeah, let's take a step back. You're right, Billi. There is something going on of note, which is why this team and many other teams from around the world are here in Australia. It's because of the AFC Women's Asian Cup. That's the Asian Football Confederation's major international women's tournament. Australia is playing host to the Asian Cup, so there are games happening right around the country. And Iran's women's national team, known as the Lionesses, were here to compete as one of those many nations. So they arrived on the Gold Coast to play their group matches, and their opening game was against South Korea on the 2nd of March. And that is where this story really begins.
And so my understanding of what happened at that match is that when it came to the team singing their national anthem prior to the game, they didn't sing it.
That is correct. And some crucial context here is that this match took place just a couple of days after the US and Israel launched strikes on Iran, airstrikes that we know now killed the supreme leader, the Ayatollah. And Iran is now in an active conflict. So this war with the US has really spread right across the Middle East. So that is the backdrop against which these footballers were sitting on the Gold Coast playing in a tournament. So before the game kicked off, as you mentioned, Billi, the Iranian players didn't sing their national anthem. Instead, they stood in silence, and this was a silent protest. Iranian state media were really quick to condemn this action, though. One presenter labelled the players as traitors. He called their silence, quote, the pinnacle of dishonour.
Which are some pretty strong words. In terms of why they didn't sing the national anthem, was it an act of protest?
Well, the players themselves haven't actually spoken to the protest, but we can glean a lot about their motivations based on what's been happening on the ground in Iran. Now, to understand that, we need to take it back a little bit. In late December last year, the largest civilian protests since the 1979 Islamic Revolution broke out right across Iran. Now that spread to over 100 cities. We had the people of Iran taking to the streets, initially over a collapsing economy, but essentially these protests came against the regime itself. Calls to end the regime, calls from the civilians of Iran to take back their freedoms and independence. Now, we saw the regime crack down violently against those protests. The exact death toll is disputed or not entirely known, but many human rights groups estimate that tens of thousands of people in Iran were killed during this violence which was condemned by countries and humanitarian groups right around the world, even, months before the current conflict that we're seeing unfold.
So we have here precedent for the Iranian regime, I guess, acting quite violently towards the people who protest against their regime. So the concern here with the women's football team is that their safety might be in danger because of this if they return home. Is that right?
Exactly. So many feared that basically after that protest, after they refused to sing the anthem, that they might return home. And given the recent violence, and also because we know the Iranian regime has executed people for this kind of act, what it calls treason in the past. So there were these concerns that the Iranian players were no longer safe should they return home.
So at this point, we have a group of Iranian football players on Australian soil competing in the Asian Cup with a war raging in their home country. They refused to sing their national anthem during their first match, but they had 2 more matches to play on Australian soil before they went home. What happened in those 2 games?
So the situation escalated and evolved when Iran played their second match. Now that was against the Matildas, the Aussie team, on Thursday. And that's when the Iranian players actually took to the field before the game and they did sing their national anthem. They gave a military salute. And that was a full reversal from what we saw just days earlier. It sounded the alarm for many human rights campaigners who feared that the women had been coerced into singing the anthem. They were concerned about pressure by Iranian minders who have reportedly been accompanying the women and the team everywhere they've gone in Australia. So, for example, escorting them to their meals, not allowing them to move about their hotel unaccompanied. So we then had that pivot, concerns about pressure. They did play that game against the Matildas. At the end of the game, there was this really beautiful moment that has resonated across the country. The Matildas ended up swapping jerseys with every single member of the Iranian women's team. So it was this beautiful moment of kind of solidarity. The Tillies captain, Sam Kerr, said, quote, "Obviously, we have a lot of respect for them and we're trying to support and put an arm around them." Foreign Minister Penny Wong later said that the jersey swap was a very evocative moment that spoke to solidarity and the way in which sport can bring us together.
Okay, so that was the second match.
Yep.
And then there was a third one.
Yes. So Iran lost their third game 2-0 to the Philippines on Sunday. They were knocked out of the competition. And at the end of the game, we saw this protest unfolding at the stadium. So in the team bus outside the stadium, as they tried to leave, about 200 people had gathered. They were banging on the side of the bus. They were chanting, "Let them go." Police ended up having to intervene. But what that protest symbolized was this growing call across the country, basically for the Australian government to intervene. These protesters were calling on the government to offer these women asylum in Australia so they wouldn't have to return home to Iran and potentially face violence or repercussions over that anthem incident. So yeah, it turned political, and that's what those protesters were asking for.
And the reason why this all kind of escalated yesterday is because the Australian government did announce that they will be granting humanitarian visas to the players if they want them.
Hey, I'm Sam. I'm the co-founder of TDA. With one button, 82% of you who aren't subscribed to this YouTube channel can change that and help Australian media. Click subscribe. Now back to the video.
Yes, so a lot was already happening behind the scenes. This was in the works seemingly for many more days and weeks than we perhaps have comprehended just yet. Home Affairs Minister Tony Burke had actually flown to Brisbane. He had met with members of the team personally days before anything became public. And then on Monday night, the Australian Federal Police ended up moving 5 players out of the team's hotel on the Gold Coast to a secure location. And on Tuesday morning, Tony Burke confirmed those 5 players had been granted humanitarian visas. He described their reaction as joy and relief, and he said they were excited to embark on life in Australia.
Can I ask a quick question? You just said that the Australian Federal Police escorted 5 players out of their hotel. When I first read this on Tuesday morning, it said that they had escaped and they were escaping out of you talked before about the team's handlers who potentially were part of the regime or representing the regime.
Yep, definitely.
And so that sounded super dramatic. I didn't realize that the AFP was actually assisting in them escaping.
Yeah, well, I mean, we don't know yet, and there'll be many security reasons why we don't know and may never know, but I'm sure there would have been some kind of covert operation, coordination between federal police, authorities, government, the players, the team. I don't think it would have been as simple as these women just, packing their bags and walking out of the hotel.
No. Okay, so these 5 women have now been granted humanitarian visas. What does that practically mean? That they're now able to live in Australia forever?
Yeah, Tony Burke didn't specify the exact type of visa that they have been given, but what we do know broadly about humanitarian visas here in Australia is that they will essentially give the players a pathway to permanent residency and eventually Australian citizenship if that's what they want. So these visas give holders the right to work and study in Australia depending on the specifics, things like access to Medicare, the right to work. Potentially it means that the government may be able to sponsor family members to join these women in Australia. So there are a kind of broad range of themes and protections that they'll be offered with that kind of a visa. The specifics yet, though, we don't know.
And my understanding is that the Australian government offered these humanitarian visas to the whole team, but it was only 5 women who actually wanted it. Is that right?
Well, I think there's an important difference between 5 women who wanted the visas and 5 women who accepted the visas. So there has been a lot of conversation in the last day or two about what's actually at stake for these players if they don't go home to Iran, if they stay in Australia indefinitely. Now, we did hear some community leaders saying early on Tuesday that they were hopeful that more women were going to take up the offer and stay here. But on Tuesday afternoon, a bus with players from the soccer team actually left their Queensland hotel bound for the airport. There was a police escort around that bus. There were more protesters who tried to intervene to stop them. But ultimately, that bus made its way to the airport with what we can assume is the rest of the team to return to Iran.
What are some of the reasons that these women wouldn't want to accept the humanitarian visa if there is so much concern that they will be persecuted if they go back to Iran?
What is at stake here for these women is not just their own lives and livelihoods, it's their families as well. So many of these players will have all of their family still living in Iran. There are fears that if they fail to return home, that their families could then be targeted, could then be subjected to violence or worse, or face criminal proceedings. So it's not just about giving up whatever way of life they have had in Iran. It's also about factoring in their family's safety. It also has to be said that the women who have accepted these visas, they have an entirely clean slate, for better or for worse, but that means leaving behind their family, their loved ones, their possessions, their assets. There is so much to weigh up. So for some of these women, staying in Australia means protecting themselves, but for others, it could mean putting their families at greater risk. So it's by no means a simple choice.
Okay, and one thing that we haven't mentioned is that US President Donald Trump was part of the growing calls for the Australian government to grant these women asylum. He actually had a call with Albanese overnight on Monday or Tuesday?
Yeah, I think this was a little bit surprising for some people just in terms of Trump has a lot going on at the moment with the ongoing conflict between the US and Iran. Of course, he has been a vocal critic of the Iranian regime. He has publicly spoken out many times against a humanitarian crisis there, but he did weigh in on Truth Social. He urged Albanese to offer the team asylum. He warned that allowing them to return to Iran would be a terrible mistake. And he then posted again saying that he had personally spoken to Albanese at 2:00 in the morning, mind you, on Monday night or Tuesday morning. And Albanese confirmed those talks. He said that they were very positive, but clearly these movements, these visas were in the works before Trump weighed in. There has also been rare bipartisan consensus on this one too. So the opposition's Shadow Home Affairs Minister, John O'Donoghue, he was actually credited by Tony Burke as working with the government to protect the women's best interests. So the coalition and Labor working together on the same page here about the importance of this issue.
And this has happened before. I know there is precedent for this kind of thing happening before in Australia. Do you know how I know that there's precedent for this kind of thing in Australia?
How do you know?
Because when I was working on this story early yesterday morning, Sam, who's one of TDA's co-founders, he said, when I was learning to be a lawyer, I worked on a case like this back in 2017 or something for athletes that were seeking asylum in Australia.
Yeah.
And that's how I learned that there is precedent for this.
Well, you might remember back in 2021, there was a really high profile story, similarly high profile to this one. And that was when the Taliban retook Afghanistan and banned women's sport. So Australia actually granted emergency humanitarian assistance to the women's cricket team from Afghanistan. There were 22 women on the cricket team, and more than 130 people in total actually ended up getting these emergency visas that included players and their families. So at the time, there were these extraordinary stories of bravery, these players that had to burn their cricket gear to avoid being caught and identified. They had to cross the border into Pakistan in small groups. Eventually, they were settled in Canberra and Melbourne, and that was a huge effort led by volunteers, some high-profile names in Aussie sport too. So Australia certainly has a track record here.
And so where does this leave us today? That we have this team who right now, as this podcast goes out, is potentially now landing in Iran. And then we have the 5 players who are remaining in Australia. Anything else?
That's pretty much it for now. We've got those 5 players. They've accepted the visas. They're in a safe location. They're basically beginning new lives in Australia. But for the rest of the squad, the future is uncertain. It will be unclear, what kind of an Iran they are flying home to, what kind of repercussions they may be facing. But the Prime Minister has been really clear. Anthony Albanese says, if you want our help, the help is here. FIFA, the global international governing body for football, has confirmed that it's in close contact with authorities about the team's welfare. There is certainly huge international attention on this story, so you would have to hope that that means that the women's safety is somewhat assured or that repercussions are delayed, but there's a long way for this story to run. These women have a long road ahead of them, and we'll keep a close eye on what we learn in the days to come.
Thank you for taking us through that today.
Thank you, Billi.
And thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Daily Aus. We'll be back later today with the evening headlines, but until then, we hope you have a lovely evening.